1685, wrote Jock Purves, was a terrible year in a terrible era.
Daniel Defoe, the celebrated author of Robinson Crusoe, argued that the Scottish government's treatment of Covenanters in that year was worse even than the persecuting campaigns of Roman emperors and Popish inquisitors. In this third instalment of our mini-series on the Covenanters, we'll find out what life was like for the Covenanters in the so-called killing time, focusing particularly on one man, John Brown of Priesthill, one of the Covenanter martyrs commemorated here in Muirkirk in Ayrshire.
We are setting out for a remote spot outside of the village where one of the most brutal extrajudicial killings of Covenanting times took place. The village of Muirkirk, Ayrshire, was remote in the 1680s, and it feels quite isolated even to this day, surrounded by moorland, wind farms, and managed forestry. John Brown lived with his wife Isabel on a croft, a small farm northeast of the village. From what we can tell, he was a peasant and a carrier, a kind of early modern postman.
John Brown was never rich, owning just 20 sheep, 2 cows and an old mare, and having several debts when he was killed. Despite his poverty, he had a bright intellect and used to organize what might be called an informal rural school of theology. He would gather young men keen to learn the scriptures, meeting with them in the sheepfolds in the summer and around the peat fire in his kitchen in the winter.
Despite their poverty, John and Isabel Brown were true Covenanters and servants of their fellow saints. They opened their hearts and their home, such as it was, to the travelling preachers who led fugitive lives, conducting a meeting in a valley here or on a hilltop there. One such preacher was Alexander Peden, who had married them 3 years before. At the wedding, Peden had prophesied to Isabel, "Ye have a good man to be your husband, but ye will not enjoy him long. Prize his company, and keep linen by you to be his winding sheet. For ye will need it when ye are not looking for it, and it will be a bloody one." What extraordinary words with which to begin one's married life.
In our previous video, we met Sir James Turner, the professional soldier whose cruelty sparked the so-called Pentland Rising. Another persecutor, Sir John Graham of Claverhouse, or Viscount Dundee as he was known, came to prominence in the 1670s and 80s. Brutally efficient, in September 1678, he was tasked with suppressing the Covenanters of southwest Scotland. By 1685, court politics had put him in a tight spot, and he seems to have been driven by a need to prove his value to the Stuart monarchy. In May of that year, we find him at the head of 3 troops of dragoons, ranging through the hills of Ayrshire and Galloway, searching for Covenanting preachers in the hills. The morning of May the 1st, 1685, dawned with an ominous mist. Alexander Peden, the travelling preacher, had stayed the night with the Browns, but took his leave very early. As he left, he remarked, "Poor woman, a fearful morning, a dark, misty morning." After family worship, John Brown went out between 5 and 6 in the morning to prepare peat that would serve as fuel for his little family in the coming months. On the misty moor, he was spotted by Graham's dragoons. He was caught and taken back to his cottage for interrogation. Graham found bullets, match, and what he took to be incriminating papers in the carrier's home. What these papers were, we will never know. A ruthless implementer of ruthless legality, John Graham told John Brown, "Go to your prayers, for you shall immediately die." As Isabel looked on, a child at her side and pregnant with another, John turned to her and said, "Now, Isabel, the day is come that I told you would come when I spoke to you first of marrying me." She replied, "Indeed, John, I can willingly part with you." He kissed his wife and children, asking promised and purchased blessings from God for them, and prayed for the last time. Graham interrupted Brown 3 times, accusing him of preaching, not praying. The accounts we have differ when it comes to the execution itself. Some maintain that 6 dragoons fired on Brown at Graham's command. Another tradition maintains that the dragoons refused to carry out Graham's orders, and so he pulled out his pistol and did the bloody deed himself. What is not in doubt is that Graham took it upon himself to put John Brown to death, on the spot, in full view of his wife and children. When the deed was done, the sneering soldier turned to Isabel and asked, "What thinkest thou of thy husband now, woman?" She said, "I thought ever much good of him, and as much now as ever." He retorted, "It were but justice to lay thee beside him." She asked how he would ever account for his morning's work. He said, "To man I can be answerable, and as for God, I will take him in my own hand." The grieving widow was left to gather up her husband's scattered brains, bind up his head, and cover him with a blanket. The house being so remote, it was some time before any soul came to comfort her.
It is easy to think that the only sufferers during the killing time were those who were themselves executed.
Many women were widowed, and many children made fatherless by the outstretched arm of a power-crazed state and its grasping servants. The suffering visited on the Covenanter women and children cannot be quantified and will not be recompensed until that time when the Lord Jesus himself will avenge the blood of the martyrs. We do not know what became of Isabel Brown and her children. We cannot now find out how she managed her husband's debts, provided for her children, or came to grips with the violence visited on her family. What we do hear is her voice of gentle defiance in defense of her godly husband. "I thought ever much good of him, and as much now as ever." The story of John and Isabel Brown is particularly poignant because they were just ordinary Christians, ordinary covenanting folk. Not rich, not powerful, not close to any of Scotland's power centres in the church or state. They represent to us the sufferings of the greater body of the Covenanters, who were not church ministers, but members, Christ's flock, scattered and pursued across moor and mountain as they remained faithful to their Lord in evil days. If you want to read more about John Brown, his story is told in brief in J.K. Hewison's The Covenanters in 2 volumes, and somewhat more fully in John Howie's The Scots Worthies, both of which will be linked below.
One account of John Brown's final morning says that during family worship he read Psalm 27. While we can't now verify this, surely words from verses 3 and 4 of that psalm are particularly suitable in John Brown's case. "Against me, though a host encamp, my heart yet fearless is. Though war against me rise, I will be confident in this. One thing I of the Lord desired, and will seek to obtain, that all days of my life I may within God's house remain."